So, good evening and good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining this series of lectures offered by the Collective for Reimagining Engineering and Innovation. Today we have the pleasure of listening to Dr. G.S. Bhuvaneshwar, who is an expert on medical devices. Right now, he's an independent technical consultant to companies, startups, and also companies working in medical devices. He's also on the advisory forum of BIRAC. Prior to this, he was associated for a very long period, 36 years, with Sri Chitrai Tirunal Institute. And he was the head of the medical technologies division within the institute. And he has got his PhD from there and master's from IIT Madras, and he's a BTech in electronics. So you will see a flavor of an electronic person moving into a complete mechanical design. He's also credited with designing the Chitra valve, which is one of the very successful technologies which has also been commercialized by TTK Healthcare. So with that quick overview, I'll invite Dr. G.S. Bhuvaneshwar to share his views on looking at medical devices design, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sudhir. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and my thanks to all the organizers for kindly inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. So today my talk is on the concept, what's generally called the design controls for medical devices. Originally, the idea started sometime in the, I think, late 70s to early 80s in Canada, and then US FDA sort of formalized it as a part of their regulatory requirement. So it's quite a sort of a long, detailed thing. I usually do it at a one-day workshop sort of a thing, basically a lot of elements to it. So I'll primarily give a more like an introduction in this 1 hour talk. Okay. So shall I share the screen? So this is briefly an introduction to the whole sort of process of what is called medical device design controls. So I'll talk about 4 parts of it. First one is, why do we really need them? Why do we need to sort of have them? Why do we need to practice them, I would say? Then what are they actually? And when do we start applying them in the actual medical device development process? And then how do we apply them during our product development? So these are the 4 elements of anyway, medical device development or any product development as a whole. And so how do we apply this? This is the whole introduction I'm doing. So the first part is on why do we need design controls in medical devices? This is the basic question we need. And I think to answer that, we need to look at what is the need for medical device regulations. As many of you know, medical devices are a regulated product class, just like drugs and many other areas, maybe aircraft and so on. The main reason why medical devices are regulated is they can cause harm. Just like drugs, they can cause harm leading to serious injury, sometimes even death. So it's the responsibility of the manufacturers to prove the safety and performance of medical devices before they are placed on the market. I think this is the critical underlying requirement of all medical device regulations internationally. And that manufacturers in general mean including all those who develop the device, who sort of scale it up, test it, and then manufacture it, market it, and so on. So it involves the whole group of all the stakeholders involved in getting the device into the market. So it starting from the design, then goes on to development, all the testing that needs to be done, the preclinical testing and the clinical evaluation, and then it also covers manufacturing and sales. So remember that medical device regulations covers the whole gamut, starting from design and development to manufacturing, sale, and also in post-market follow-up. So the other requirement is also, which many of us forget, is that regulatory requirement is that the device must reach the user in its intended condition. It's not enough if you develop it and goes out of your factory, but it must reach the user in the intended conditions. So regulations also cover packaging, labeling, and the transportation safety issues. I think it's necessary to remember that. Now, the primary legal thing is of medical device regulations is ensuring safety and performance, and is a requirement by law. In India, we have the CDSCO, that's the Center for Devices, Drugs Standards and something organization, I keep forgetting that expansion. And they have put up the medical device rules of 2017. The rules were published on 1st January of 2017. And it has become effective from 1st January of 2018. These rules have been notified under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. Please remember that. It's still under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act primarily. And from 1st October of this year, that is next month, all devices are regulated. From last year, only the class, C and D devices were regulated. But from 1st of October, that is 1st of next month, all devices are regulated. So all medical device manufacturers have to get a license from the Drug Controller of India. In the EU, basically it's the US FDA who licenses and regulates the medical devices. And in Europe, it is through the competent authorities with the requirement for CE marking. And in other countries like Health Canada, then we have the Therapeutic Goods Agency in Australia and so on, the number of. So the two important aspects of which affect medical device development manufacturing, one is the regulation. What are the regulatory requirements? What are the rules? What is the law? What is you need to do? And compliance is the responsibility of the manufacturer to show compliance to the medical regulatory requirements. Now, one of the reasons design controls came out was that sometimes in the 1980s, US FDA found that 44% of voluntary recalls of medical devices from the market could have been prevented by adequate design controls. That means the devices were better designed. If the design process had been better carried out, then around 44%, almost you can say half of the recalls, that is devices with problems which are recalled by manufacturers, could have been prevented. And their survey between 83 and 89 found that again, 90% of all software related failures were related to design issues. So it was during the design and not really related to manufacturing. So the main question which they were concerned with is how to ensure that medical devices are designed to be safe, reliable, and perform as per specifications, or as per what the manufacturer claims them to do. So this is the basic requirement. How do you ensure that when you are designing a product, you can make sure that you design a safe and the product which will perform as you require it to? This is the big question. And this is where design controls comes into the picture. I just want to highlight some of the failures that have happened. I think the one that I'm sort of more familiar with are the various medical device failures. This is called the Bioch-Shaley valve, which had a lot of tissue overgrowth issues in the early, I think this came out in early 70s. And then later they made improvements to their design, what was called the convex-concave model. And that valve failed with, this strut or the wire that's holding the disc in place sort of broke off. And ultimately they ended up with, I think, around over 600 or 800 failures over the world. Then it went into a class action suit and the whole company got closed down. So this is one of the risks of if you don't design it properly or test it properly. I'm sorry. This is an older, early 60s valve called Vada cutter. This is the Star Edward valve, where we had a concept problem of what's called ball variance. Early days, a silicone rubber ball in this Star Edward's valve used to swell after about 6 months, 9 months in the patient and would get stuck. This is the earlier model of the Bioch-Shaley valve with the Delrin, where you can see it chipped off. This is, I think, one of the bileaflet valves where the disc has escaped, broken, and so on. These are classic failures of mechanical valves that can happen, and maybe occasionally do happen even today, despite all the care that has gone into. Our own development, we started in the 78, 80s. We went through 3 cycles of failure. Fortunately, none of these got into the patient, because most of these failures happened in our in vitro testing and animal studies. The first model failed due to failure of near the weld joint. This was electron beam welded titanium metal cages. And you can see the crack there. And then we moved on to integrally machined cage. Despite not having CNC machining in those days, we still managed to machine these metal cages out of a cobalt-based alloy called Haynes 25. But we were using a single crystal aluminum because this plastic Delrin was giving us problems due to swelling. But then these discs fractured in our animal studies. So we were very fortunate that way, I think. But failures do happen, and you need to really, so that's where the importance of both preclinical testing, that's in vitro testing, and animal testing is important. These are some of the failures that have happened internationally. This is the silicone rubber breast implants from France, which have failed. And the main reason was the manufacturer sort of was trying to shortcut the quality of the silicone used. So he was he was actually making implants with silicone rubber, which was not really medical grade. And so the whole company got into legal issue problems. These are blood pressure monitors. Usually a lot of them give trouble. They do have a lot of sort of shifting, and the defibrillators where there was a lot of delay in where the shock was giving the shock and had to be recalled. Then the other famous one is the metal-on-metal hip joints, which are Johnson & Johnson's metal-on-metal hip joint failed. I don't know if many of you are aware. This is a dental implant which has cracked, and orthopedic implant. So these are very common. They do happen even today. So ensuring safety of a medical device is our moral and ethical obligation, apart from, of course, business. And as I said, some of the companies have closed down because of device failures, particularly if the failure is due to either sort of negligence or bad manufacturing. Please remember that I think one of the questions I think I suggest all of us ask as device developers and designers are, if this valve is in the market, would we use it or so close relatives, our family, friends, and even parents? Would you agree? Would you feel comfortable if the device is? Big question we all need to ask. And if you can ask that and honestly say that yes, and then I think you're ready to move forward. So the main thing is design controls helps us ensure that the product comes out as safe and works as you claim it to be. So what are design controls? So design controls are a set of quality control practices and procedures which you have to implement or you put into practice starting from design, development, through all the testing, in vitro testing, animal testing, whatever testing you do, and then go on to manufacturing and sale, so that you finally ensure that your product is safe and performs as you claim it to be. So right now it's a legal requirement for all medical device regulations all over the world. Safety, as I mentioned, is a moral and ethical requirement, and regulatory agencies require proof. So you need to produce proof that your device is safe. This is the big question. And you also need to produce proof that your device meets the user needs and intended use, or you claim the device will do, you have proof that it does that. Now, this is a famous waterfall called the cascade model, which was originally sort of brought out by Health Canada and then adopted by US FDA. This is one of the well-known models of design controls. So these are the various elements used. Of course, once the initial ideation and proof of development, you would have identified the unmet needs or the clinical needs. So you start with the user needs, then we have the design inputs. You derive the design inputs from the user needs. And then you go through all the design process of making prototypes. And then the outputs of your testing, the design outputs, you verify against design inputs. So this is the first cycle of verification. There's a feedback there to show that whatever data you get in terms of performance and safety, it meets your design inputs or design requirements. So once you're through this and you show that your design outputs meets your design inputs, then you move on to having a real actual medical device in some sort of a pilot scale and go on to what is called user validation or clinical trials. And then show that in the clinical trials, it meets the user's needs. So many times you may develop a device, it may meet your design inputs, but it may not be what your user really needs. So the validation is required to prove that the device you have developed really meets the user's needs. So this is the broad concept of design controls. So at each stage, you also need to do a review and documentation. And today's regulatory requirements also require that you apply risk management during this whole process as per ISO 14971. That's another standard, but I'm not getting into those details right now. So some of the benefits of design controls, definitely, of course, you have an improved product in quality and safety. You reduce the chances of design flaws. Primarily, it doesn't, of course, if you had to practice it rigorously, doesn't mean you eliminate all design flaws, but you reduce the chances and the risk of failure. Then you have enhanced regulatory compliance. It's internationally now required that you show that design has been controlled. You have to produce documentation for that. And by reducing the failures, by doing risk management, you also reduce the time to market. So it also helps in reducing failures and time to market. So the third part of design controls is when do we start? We have life cycle of product development getting into market. So when do we start applying these design controls? So before that, we need to get an idea of involved in medical device development. So the whole process of what are involved. I like to see it, part of it in one way of looking at it is like a 3-layered cake. So we have the technical layer where we look at device design and prototyping, all the testing, the verification and validation. Then you go up to scale manufacturing, clinical studies, and so on. Then you need to, of course, the business layer, this is there for all medical devices. What are the intellectual property rights you have? What are the investment requirements? How do you market and sell it, and so on. But I think in medical devices, you have the additional layer of meeting regulatory requirements, both in terms of ethics, legal requirements, and also legal requirements, as I said, of applying the quality management as per ISO 13485 and risk management as per 14972, and also doing all the documentation to show you meet all the regulatory requirements. So the documentation is an important part. So another way of looking at realization is what are the different phases, steps involved in development. First is, of course, discovery or ideation phase, where you look at on to develop a proof of concept prototype. So this is what most startups use with, and this is where most of you are in the early phases of your development. So once you have a working prototype, a proof of concept prototype, you need to move on to the bigger stage, that is the development stage, where you look at more systematically the manufacturing process. So then you need to really start the design controls. Stage is the pilot production for user validation or clinical trials. Then you move on to manufacturing, marketing, and then what regulatory requirements are post-market. Today, you need to look at market performance, failure analysis, and if you make improvements, how do you make improvements and ensure that the device continues to be safe. Second part is, I'm sorry, just a minute. So the second block is where all the regulatory requirements apply, all the ISO 13485 requirements apply, and where you need to maintain all the documentation. And this is when you need to start your controls and apply design controls throughout the whole process. Another way of looking at sort of development is what Professor B. Ravi of IIT Bombay is Professor of Mechanical Engineering. He heads that METIC Center, which is the Innovation Center for Medical Devices at IIT Bombay. He has a very nice book. I think I would encourage all of you to read that book. He defines 4 stages of the whole product development life cycle in terms of defining the unmet need, the product or making the device, and then testing and certifying it, and then selling it to users. Again, if you look at it, your design controls will start when you're into development, and then you go on to test, certification, manufacturing, and so on. Another way, this is one I like. This is the way I did my valve development, way we look at it, or where we looked at it, I would say, where we looked at the user needs and also assessing the requirements. Down to look at the choice of design and materials for our heart valve. Then we did a prototype fabrication, did all the testing, performance evaluation, both in laboratory as well as in animal models. And then, of course, each time we had a failure, we had to go through, we did a review of why the failure occurred and how do we how to improve the design to prevent the failure. And during this process, you also need to all the component and material qualifications. So for an implant, you need to apply the ISO 10993 set of standards testing for biocompatibility, blood compatibility, and so on. And usually, from my experience, the cycle takes about 3 to 5 iterations. So we will have at least 3-4 failures of prototypes, working prototype, I would call it. And then you're ready to go into user validation, which requires some sort of a pilot production to make enough devices for actual clinical trials or clinical testing. And you're successful there, you go on to getting regulatory approvals. I mean, you need regulatory approval for clinical trials, and once you do all that, you can get your licensing and then get on to manufacturing market. Another way of looking at this also that if you look at the proof of concept stage, the innovation stage, you have a product idea, you develop a solution concept, you do a lot of prototyping and some early performance testing, and then say, yay, my selected prototype works, and you say proof of concept is ready. But what happens, many of us think that, yes, that is the end of the development. Unfortunately, that's, I would say, the beginning of the development phase. It's the end of all the, the interesting phase of innovation. The development phase is a regulated space. The advantage of the POC stage is free. You have a lot of freedom to innovate. You have a lot of freedom to think laterally or different ways to come up with a good concept which really works. But then when you get into the regulated space of development, it's all hard work and preparation. So you go down to developing a working prototype. So you need to identify your vendors, develop SOPs to produce the product in at least in small quantities, reproducible and reliable. And this is when you need to apply the ISO 13485. This is, in a sense, ISO 13485 is the key to opening the door into your development phase. And this is when you start applying design control. So remember what Edison said, genius is 1% and 99% perspiration. So the design controls is all in this 99% perspiration. Work, a lot of documentation to be done. So your genius, your inspiration phase with your proof of concept. And there's a lot of hard work ahead. But remember that if you go through all the hard work and you have a product, there is a satisfaction that you can achieve, which you don't get with just in your first having a proof of concept prototype in the lab. And the fourth part is how to apply design controls for product development. So these are the different elements of design controls. One is defining your general requirements for the product, including the or your performance requirements. Then you have to do a design and development planning. The requirements of design controls is you go through it systematically, have a design and development plan. How are you going to do it? What are the different materials required? What are the various vendors who need to be qualified? and define your design inputs from your user needs. And then your prototyping and you have your design outputs. And then, as I said, when your output, you do your testing, design verification, and the failures are there, you have to do the reviews. And once you have a working prototype, you go on to the clinical user validation. And then if you make this, you go back, you have to go back and redo all your inputs and all that. And finally, when you're ready, you transfer it to the manufacturing team who can manufacture and sell the product. Remember that as far as regulatory is concerned, nothing is proved unless it is documented. Unless you can do it in documented fashion with test reports and test results and so on, then none of the regulators are going to believe that you've done all this. So just showing them a product is not enough. You need to show that you've done all the things required for ensuring that your product is safe and your product works as you claim it to be. So the documentation requirements are you need to develop what's called history file. You also have to create what's called, and these are essential records which basically clearly sort of document how we have gone about developing the device. So briefly, just one on what is the importance of design and development planning. So identify the design and development stages. What are the different, and you're going to do your design reviews. So remember that sort of, so I would say splitting down your workload or to work modules and tasks is very critical. So having a plan and doing it in a systematic way of development is very useful. You also need to define the responsibility for all the activities. Who is going to be responsible for doing what? And then, so who are the team members? What are list your team members, their role and responsibilities, and clearly define what they'll be doing during the development phase. You also need to identify your suppliers or vendors and then qualify them in terms of materials and equipment, particularly the key equipment that goes into your product. But one thing you should remember that the plan should evolve throughout the design and development phase. It's not a static document. It's not something you write in the beginning and then try to stick to it throughout. Because as you go through the development phase, you're going to have changes, you're going to have failures, you're going to need to make changes. And the plan also needs to evolve throughout that. So it's not a once and done document, but you need to revisit and update it all the time, particularly after each. I would say generally my experience, you need to update it after every design review. When you had a prototype, you tested it, it has some shortcomings, then you do a review, you document all that, and then. So this is just the waterfall diagram with all the elements of the design. I think I've gone through that. And the other important regulatory requirement generally called a document traceability matrix, where you have the 5 stages of design, that is user needs, design inputs, design outputs, design verification, that's all your in vitro testing, and then the design or the clinical studies. So your user needs must have validated output from your clinical studies. So your user needs must be validated with data from your inputs. So this table or matrix basically gives you what are the outputs, what are the reports, or what are the clinical studies which really show that you met your needs. So the last and the first column need to be linked with so this gives documentation. So a regulatory from a regulatory authority or a notified body is able to identify the document which will show him that you have proof of your user needs. The same thing applies to design verification versus design inputs. Sites, it provides the linkages, and it's something like a recipe which contains all that is needed for you to eventually go back and manufacture the product. So that's an important document. It's one of the recommended ways of tracking all your documentation and linking them to your inputs, user needs and design inputs. And US FDA likes this. I don't know about our Indian regulatory. I don't think our Indian regulatory system has evolved that much, but I think but it will help you make sure that you have done all your testing and you've done all your design and clinical trials properly to ensure that you met all inputs and user needs approved. Other question that usually comes up is what's the difference between design controls and product development? Product development, as I said, involves much more. It involves a layer, it involves the technical aspects, a lot of aspects of product development. And design controls is a smaller part of the design, controlling the design process. So you can take it, the design controls is a part of product development, but it's not everything. It's not the whole product development, but a part of it. So this is where the regulators take a close look. So remember that this is what regulators look at very closely. So I just wanted to sort of give you a sort of a case study of our Chitra valve. So this was the design features we originally identified. We wanted a large effective orifice area to ensure that the flow resistance will be minimal when the valve opens for forward flow. We have the struts which are integrated in the ring so that we don't have the failure of the welded issues. Then we wanted the disc to rotate so that the wear is distributed. The problem with heart valves is, our heart beats 1 lakh times a day, 100,000 times a day. In a year, it goes through 38 million cycles. And so in a 10-year lifetime, you're talking about the 400 million cycles of opening and closing. So there's a huge amount of wear and tear. The valve is subject to enormous fatigue stresses and wear issues. So you need materials which are wear resistant. So we want to distribute the wear by having a disc that can rotate. And then we wanted clearance with disc so that the blood flows. Blood has a tendency to clot whenever there are joints or this one. So we needed to minimize that. And so this is also another area, what we call the clot to metal interface is another area where some of the other requirements we listed was the material requirements like biocompatibility, blood compatibility. It should be non-degradable because it has to last the lifetime of a patient, 20, 30, 40 years. And then in terms of performance or functional requirements, it should permit unidirectional flow with minimum forward resistance. It should close quickly. So as I said, minimum resistance to forward flow and very, very low leak or no regurgitation when the valve is closed. Surgical side, it must be easy to puncture into the heart. So these are the part of the user needs. Of course, from a durability, it has to withstand heavy wear and fatigue resistance to last a lifetime of the patient, maybe at least 30, 40 years. And it has to be supplied sterile at the time of implantation. So some of our design choice was restricted because our mean age of our valve patients wasn't 20 to 30. This I'm talking about in the 70s. So the concept of a tissue valve, those times this pig's tissue aortic valves could be treated in glutaraldehyde were also in the market. But those valves are not suitable for implantation in young people. So we had to go for a mechanical design. And we wanted a low profile because Indians are of our weights or lower, maybe more in the 50 to 70 kg category. So our heart sizes are also smaller relatively. And so we needed a design with relatively low profile. So that's one of the reasons, that's the basis of our choosing this tilting disc design there. And then, of course, as I said, part of the development is all the testing. So in fact, I spent a lot of time, I can around 30, I think, when we were setting up the steady flow test system for studying the forward flow characteristics of us. So setting up test systems can be as big a project as the development of the product in many cases. So a lot of effort, time, and money goes into all. So this needs to be planned. If you don't plan this, then you run into problems of not knowing where the money will come or how you're going to test your product. This is the other pulse stimulator. This basically we look at the functional performance of the valve by simulating a pulsatile flow in a valve. So this is something like a left heart of a simulator on the left side. And this is the PC-based control system that was developed to collect the data acquisition. So all this, in fact, this was a model 2 of a pulse duplicator. So there's a lot of work in developing these test systems. And the third one was the durability, where we were cycling the valves at 700 times a minute, about 10 times the acceleration of the normal cycling at 70 times a minute. So that in about 1 year of non-stop running, we could get the equivalent of 10 years of closing of the valve. This is again our model. I think this is our model 3, Mark 3 model of our test system. First one was really bad. It was leaking all over the place. And model 2 really worked well, and this is a model 3. So a lot of development into that. And the last one, of course, was our animal evaluation. In fact, animal studies can be really challenging and expensive. And in fact, it took us about 1.5 years to get a right animal model. We started with dogs, then we went on to calf, because at the time calf was being used in the total heart studies in US, but that did not work for us. Then we tried pigs, and finally we found that the sheep as animal model worked well. But that all this involved the clinical side, the cardiac surgeons and our anesthesiologists from the hospital were also involved. We had a veterinary surgeon to help manage these animals, but still it's a big challenge and expensive. Clinical investigation, of course, is a big thing. And our first, we started in 1990, first implant happened on 6th of December 1990. And I think it gives me great pleasure to say that that patient is still alive. He lives in Trichure in Kerala, and he's still alive. So we have all the early patients still going. And a lot of the liability that came out of this for this model was because of all the sort of extensive testing we did early time. Though it took us a long time, took us about 10 years to get this product into clinical trial stage. A lot of learning had to be done, and a lot of the failures, of course, was a major challenge, but we did through. So that's the so the valve has been in the market from 1995. I think today about close to 150,000 valves have been implanted. They're manufactured by TTK Healthcare. So to summarize, I think the design controls, as I said, starts after your proof of concept is ready. When you move into your development phase, you need to look at all the elements, particularly define your user. From the user need, derive your design inputs or your design requirements, and then go through the design process of making prototypes and testing. Then you make sure your design outputs meet your design inputs. So you do all your test verification, do your reviews and documentation, and then you're ready to move on to sort of a pilot scale production or batch production for clinical trials, so that you validate your product against the user needs. So this is, in summary, what is, and I think with that, I would like to say a very good website, a company called Greenlight Guru. His website is greenlight.guru, US. He's a consultant company for medical device development. They have a software for sort of managing on the e-documentation of all medical device development and manufacturing and so on. But unfortunately for most Indians, that's an expensive proposition to use that software. But I think they have a website where they have a lot of documents. They have some free webinars, slide decks, and so I would suggest those of you who really need to look at that website. You can even download some of the documents. Many of them are free. Webinars are free to view now. You can also, of course, listen to some of their online webinars if you register. Then I would suggest also visiting the US FDA's CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Kindly visit the website. They have a design control guideline, and you will also find some documents specific to your device, whatever you're developing. They have one on software validation also. So please feel free to reach out to these. Of course, Google search is always there for various slide decks, documents, and so on. But the first two is one I recommend. You can also look at some of the European documents. They're also available, I think, on the European Union's, I don't know which particular website. I have not seen that much, but they also have some good documents available from there. There are a couple of books on medical device development. I'd be happy to share the links. I'm sorry I didn't add that here. So with that, I'm open for questions, so feel free.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for providing an overview of the design controls along with the case study. Just one quick clarification is, when you meant design control, you are referring to the product development or product design methodology and the
process of ensuring that your design will come out safe. It's basically a management process.
Or is there a specific reference to specific rules to be followed in each of the stages?
There are no specific rules. This is the broad guideline because it varies substantially based on what product you develop. Like its software would be slightly different. Again, you start with an SRS and do that, but again, the process of verification, validation, and reviews are very much there. I think the important thing about design controls is you need to document this process. Development, failure, testing, this process needs to be documented. And that is part of, so it's essentially a quality management process, part of your quality management system. And for most companies, particularly startups and small companies, this is a good place to start the quality implementation of ISO 13485 is with implementing design controls. Rather than trying to go through a formal 13485 implementation, if you go to Greenlight Guru, he will say what is called bootstrapping. You start with design controls, and then once you reach the manufacturing prototype, pilot production manufacturing stage, then you expand your 13485 into more formal documentation of all your SOPs and testing, quality control steps and so on. So I would call it more a quality management process rather than there are no specific rules. It's what you do, but you do it. But you need to think through this, do it systematically, and make sure you have proof that you have designed a safe product and your product works as it came to be. That's the ultimate goal.
So we'll open it for questions. Participants, if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself and you can ask the question.
May I ask a question, Sudhir?
Yeah, please go ahead, Shyam.
This is Shyam Sundar. You mentioned sales and post-sales surveillance, but as part of design controls, you didn't mention maintainability of the product in the field.
It's not strictly part of the design controls process as such, but it's a regulatory requirement. Post-market surveillance is a regulatory requirement for all manufacturers. They need to follow up what is happening for the product in the market. If it's a high-risk product like a heart valve, you need to really collect data on how well your product is behaving. So maybe even organize some clinical studies and have them published. So I would say post-market survey is a regulatory requirement or a legal requirement for all medical devices. The level of follow-up, of course, varies depending on the risk of a device. Class A or Class 1 devices, low-risk devices, it's much more limited. Disposables is very, very less because, of course, single use and throw. There are field complaints you need to address them. But what happens with the design controls is if you make a change, if you see a problem in the field and you make design changes, then you go back into design controls. You need to get back starting with your design controls because you need to do a risk management and then make sure that when you make changes, you're not compromised on its safety or performance. So you need to go back to ensuring. So the amount of change will define how much of additional testing you need to do. If it's so like our new heart valve, which is now undergoing clinical studies, we made a lot of design changes, including materials. So essentially it becomes, being a high-risk device, it becomes a new device. So we need to go through the full scale of all the testing and clinical studies. But a small change may not require. So you do a risk analysis, and if you can show that the change does not create additional risks, you can go ahead and get approvals for marketing the improved product. So those are all part of design controls. Assessing risk management, going back and making sure that when you make design changes, they don't introduce new risks.
If I may, Sudhir, I'm going to ask a question. What is interesting is that you talked about the waterfall model, and then you showed your own model, which is much more a spiral model of development, right? Which is actually, if you can go back to 1957 naval architecture textbook, they talk about spiral models much more. And in that sense, I want to make two remarks. One is the design process itself, and then you have the outer process, which is also a spiral model, and you have yet another process which also is getting data from the real world and correcting. So there are three concentric circles, right? One, the internal initial design, and then the regulatory model, and then the model which is directed towards the actual implementation and use. So all three of them are feeding into each other in a very spiral sense, as you had pointed out when you said that you prefer the other model to the waterfall model.
No, I would say, no, maybe that was not exactly correct. See the waterfall, can you see my slide?
Yeah.
So the waterfall model, the design process is just, it's a big area which has been lumped there. This whole thing of design inputs, process, design outputs. But it's still a cycle there actually. So this is basically, you can think of as that process, design process in terms of making a design, prototyping, testing. So this goes through the cycle. So in a sense, it fits into the other model again. So this is you can think of this as a bigger, broader model, and this is more specific to the design and development process.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. But looking at it as a spiral, I feel provides the notion that the circularity that is there in terms of revising the model as you go along much more clearly.
Yeah, I agree. Because from my experience, every development goes through 3 to 5 iterations of prototyping before you end up with a final prototype. So I just wanted to highlight that my experience.
I think this is borne out in many other disciplines as well.
Definitely. It happens in all product development, definitely.
The last point I want to make, you kept emphasizing the notion of documentation. I teach product design, and I tell my students that documentation is at the heart of engineering. You can come up with all kinds of devices, but unless and until everything is documented systematically, you don't become a real engineer from that point of view, because that is the heart of verification, validation, and correction. If I may get your comment on that.
Agreed, Professor Subramaniam. I think the problem is in India, the emphasis on documentation and writing is very weak. I would say in general, in our schools and colleges, the development of writing skills is still very poor. If you studied in India, you would know that. So the reason I keep emphasizing documentation is because of that. Because even I had a lot of challenge when I had to document all this when we were nearing the clinical trials. I had to go back and really do all the documentation so that I could present it to our ethics committee. And that's when I learned the challenges of documentation in a sense, because the early days we were all very happy, we're working very hard, but we really didn't do the documentation that well. So that, of course, helped for the future other products that I did, like hydrocephalus shunts and all. I made sure that we did have some documentation as the development phase went on. So the reason I keep emphasizing is documentation training in India is still very weak. And I do wish engineering colleges would emphasize that, but I think it has to start at school. And I think that is something outside my control. So other than emphasizing it when I speak to students and young people, there's nothing much I can do right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, in fact, in my courses, I had 60% of the grade was on documentation to emphasize the importance of it. There are, I think, other questions. Sudhir, you may want to take them up in the chat.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat, which is, I think in the beginning you mentioned that from October 1st, all medical devices are going to come under the regulatory purview. So this question is related to that, which says, do we need to take regulatory approval for health support devices also? Which means when you say all devices, does it mean all the invasive devices or non-invasive diagnostic, everything, or?
All medical devices. So this health support devices, meaning if it comes under the definition of a medical device, then it is regulated. Our Indian regulations classify it as class A, B, C, D. A is the lowest risk and D are the highest risk devices. So for A, basically primary registration has to be done. But B requires B, C, D, C, and D require licenses for manufacturing.
So, for example, health monitoring device, will it be falling under this category?
That's I know it's very vague for me to say. Health monitoring depends on what it is. If it's just like a Fitbit wear thing, no, probably not. It doesn't come under the purview of a medical device. So the question is, does your device come under the first? You have to look at the definition of medical device and find out if it comes under the purview of a medical device. If it's a medical device, then online registration, and depending on the class or risk class of the device, a license will be required.
Then the next question is, what are the charges for certification on compliance for medical devices in India?
I have no idea right now because I have not gone through that process. It varies depending on the risk class. As I said, Class A devices is just a simple registration. There are some licensing fees. Right now in India, I think the fees are relatively modest. While if you go to US, if you want to get US FDA certifications, it can be quite expensive depending on, again, on the risk class.
Any other questions from the participants? Without FAD, can we sell medical devices in India?
I think he means FDA.
Without FDA.
No, after 1st October, you will need the controller's registration or license before you can sell them in India.
But the similar kind of guidelines you are saying are yet to be published by the Indian regulator, right?
No. The medical device rules 2017 is already published.
Okay.
In fact, I would advise all those who are getting close to the sort of marketing stage to go and visit the CDSCO website and look at all the requirements there. They have a website on which you can apply. I forget the name of that. It starts with S. Suhas, something like that. They have a portal on which you have to apply. It's an online portal. All applications have to go online. And then you have to, of course, you look at the classification. In fact, they have a published device classification also for most devices. So our CDSCO has done that to make it easier for our medical device industry to identify the risk class of the device. So there's a lot of documents there for risk classification. Examples are there, as well as the rules are there. And then based on your risk classification, you have to go through the process. There's no bypassing it legally now, though a lot of people still get away because our regulators are still not that active in catching you probably, but that's a different issue. If you want to be within the legal rules, within the legal boundaries, then you have to register or get a license depending on the risk class.
I have a follow-on. In the US, at least, besides the FDA, if there are electronic components in the device, you have to go through the underwriter laboratory certification. Is that also required in the Indian context?
So can you kindly repeat that? I missed the first part.
In the US, besides FDA approval, if you have any electronic components or electrical components in the device, medical device, you have to go through underwriter laboratory certification of no harm. Do we have such a thing in the Indian context?
Yes. India also now all those devices having electronics or embedded systems have to go through what is called the safety requirements for electromagnetic interference and emissions. So you have to get them tested from a certified laboratory. So there's a list of certified laboratories in the CDSCO website in India. So you go through one of those certified laboratories, get your device tested. Again, depends on the risk class, the level of testing or the amount of testing and costs involved depends on it, can be high. High risk devices, it can go anywhere between say 5-6 lakhs to about 18 lakhs now to get a device fully tested finally.
How strong are the institutional mechanisms in the Indian context?
I'm sorry?
How strong are these institutional mechanisms in the Indian context?
That's a difficult question. Frankly, I have to say I don't know. There are, I think, some of the, I think IIT Kanpur has set up, we're funding from BIRAC, we're funding EMI lab, I think, still setting up. They were supposed to support startups in their early phase, what is called pre-regulatory phase testing. So there are 2-3 such ventures are coming up. So more labs are there. Quite a few labs have come up. There is UL has a lab in Bangalore. I think
Yes.
one of the other notified bodies also has a lab in Bangalore and Bombay probably also. So the test there, biocompatibility testing, I think 2-3 labs are there in Bangalore, 1 or 2 in Chennai that I'm aware of. There was 1 in Surat and Hyderabad, I'm not sure. But whether they are still alive, I'm not sure.
May I ask another question if there's time?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor Bhuvaneshwar. It's an excellent talk. And you might also want to know it's the best attended talk in our whole series so far. So just good to know
That's
that.
very kind of you. Thank you.
But my question is, given the regulatory system and controls in India, so a medical device which is approved for sale through the Indian medical and through the Indian regulatory system, both electronic and medical, which other countries or parts of the world will accept that regulatory compliance in India as sufficient for the Indian product to be marketed in those countries or those parts of the world? For example, I think you implied that the USA will require FDA's approval and they probably would not accept our compliance. I don't know if that's true.
Yes.
Europe and Asia, Africa, other parts of the country. My question is a more general question about acceptance of Indian regulatory compliance outside India.
I think that is, I would say internationally, all countries require a medical device manufacturer to meet their own regulatory requirements. So if you want to market in US, you have to have a US FDA license and their approvals. If you want to market in Europe, you must have a CE mark for that. This is mandatory all over. And the same thing applies to all other countries, whether it's Australia, Canada, China, Japan is also very strict. Korea, even South Korea has a lot of strict requirements. So every country, you will need to have their license or approval before you can market a medical device in that country. That goes internationally. There's no even saying that, okay, you have an CE mark and it's approved in Europe, you can't market in US or in some, even Korea may not sometimes accept South Korea. So same thing applies to Indian products. So generally, that's one of the reasons many Indian manufacturers today prefer to get the CE mark because many of the African countries accept the CE mark devices. Particularly the North Africa, I think UAE, most of the Middle East and South African countries, maybe some of the South Asian, maybe Indonesia, I'm not sure. Malaysia has its own regulatory requirements. Singapore has, even Bangladesh, I think is fairly come up. So you will have to eventually register and get a license wherever it is. But whether whether if you're CE certified and they will automatically accept that in the application, that depends on the specific region of the country involved. Most third world countries will accept CE marking today. India does accept many of the US FDA certified devices even today, just like for drugs, they also accept. But I don't think any country will accept a license. But there's one thing required when you want to export a device from India, you need to get what's called a free, I think it's called a free sale certificate or something, or you must have a certificate showing that it's approved in India. So this is major requirement now. Even our drug controller requires that if you are importing an American device, you have to show that that device is approved in US.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhuvaneshwar, for providing an overview. We also thank all the participants who have joined. The next talk will be 2 weeks from now.
Can I announce that? I can announce that.
Please.
Yeah. The next talk will be by Albert Fritzer, is a full professor at the International University of Rabat, Morocco, and Bled School of Management in Slovenia, and also a faculty at the FAU at Erlangen-Nuremberg. And his talk will be on the pragmatic roots of engineering knowledge, a culturalist approach. He is going to talk about how engineering gets performed in different countries and different places, not just from a formal sense, and the way education and problem-solving practice actually make a difference in the way engineering is done in different parts of the world. And he'll be using examples from North Africa in the talk. And it'll be 2 weeks from now, exactly 2 weeks from now, on Wednesday at the same time. And the date is the 20th of September. And there is another talk after that, which will be on bio-inspired design, as Professor Sudhir mentioned. And we will put up these things in the webpage, and announcements will follow. Some of the videos from the last lectures have not been put up because I've been traveling. All of these will be there hopefully within the next week, including this lecture. And one of the things I want to point out is some of you request for recording, personal recording. It is not possible because if you do personal recording, the organizer recording gets destroyed. That's what I found out in one case. So please wait for us to put the recording on the page. And sorry about that inconvenience.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, sir, for joining. And
so thank you. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope all of you enjoyed the talk. It's my pleasure.